You know what I object to about this blue copy of Ulysses?
Its tendency to reappear every time we try to make one shelf less humiliating.
That too. But you called it the most traveled, unread book in the flat.
I said it had moved more often than it had been opened, which, judging by that bookmark, is defensible.
The bookmark has moved. It has just not moved very far.
A very Joycean defense. Motion without progress.
It is not a defense. I am saying that the book has had more than one life. It has been read in bits, taught in bits, lent, put aside, brought back from a second-hand shop, and used as a reminder that somebody once had a much better afternoon planned.
That is rather tender for an object that is mostly intimidating people from a height.
Yes, and that is what interests me. Why does Ulysses already feel important before someone opens it? Why can it make a person feel cultured, guilty, inadequate, ambitious, or defensive while it is still shut?
I am YY. Welcome to Critical Animal, a podcast about culture, ethics, history, and the lives of animals.
I am Bear. In our video essays, every argument begins with a specific story. But in a deep cut, we stay with the story until it gets uncomfortable. Because it is very thick, blue, and has a reputation for punishing the innocent.
That is the object-level answer. I mean the social answer.
Ah, you are going to tell me that the book is not a book.
I am going to tell you that a book can be a promise. It can promise a future self with time, quiet, patience, teachers, companions, and perhaps an annotated edition with fewer little arrows pointing to other books.
And I am going to say that a promise can also be a small piece of theater. The blue spine says, I live in a household where this could happen.
You make it sound like a municipal improvement project.
Every bookcase is a municipal improvement project. It contains plans that were never funded.
But you see the problem. The easy story is that people buy Ulysses to look clever and never read it. That story is satisfying because it allows the speaker to feel cleverer than the owner. We get to diagnose someone else's pretension from across a room.
And it is occasionally true.
Of course, prestige is real.
A rare or difficult book can have visible value even when it is not being used in the practical sense. The economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen understood that long before anyone photographed shelves for the internet. But a mechanism is not a personality test. An unread book may be a gift, an inheritance, an unfinished encounter, a college memory, a teaching object, or an act of hope.
Or a threat.
One day, I will understand you.
The point is not to acquit every owner. It is to ask why this particular book appears to belong to a special reader before an ordinary reader has begun it.
You are smuggling a great deal into ordinary reader.
Good. We need to. Who has an afternoon? Who has a teacher? Who has the language, the confidence, the money for the edition with notes, the sense that it is permissible to be confused for 200 pages?
You are making the book sound like a private club with a bad entrance policy.
Sometimes it is treated that way, but I do not want to say that Ulysses is only a private club.
It is funny, obscene, sentimental, commercial, filthy, full of advertising and gossip and bad jokes. It is not a sealed glass box called high culture. So why does it end up in the glass box?
That is the episode.
Not, why is this book difficult?
No, not even why is it prestigious. The question is, who made Ulysses feel as though it belonged to a special reader?
And you think the answer is not simply James Joyce being difficult on purpose?
Joyce matters. The book's form matters.
But the answer also involves courts, postal inspectors, editors, bookshops, printers, Paris, universities, collectors, readers, and people who had enough authority to say what counted as reading it properly. That already sounds less like a viral book and more like an international administrative disaster.
Good. Viral is probably the wrong word. It is a useful wrong word, though. People understand it. A thing goes viral because it spreads.
Yes, but the metaphor implies quick, easy, horizontal movement. One person passes a thing to another, and then another. Ulysses became durable through a much slower machinery. It was restricted, printed in small runs, fought over by lawyers, made into a special object, credited by particular literary networks, and later taught as a difficult competence. You make that sound less like a book and more like a professional qualification.
At some point, it became both.
Let us sort out the terms before you build a cathedral out of them.
Fair. Visibility is not access. A book can be visible because it is famous, scandalous, displayed, reviewed, assigned, or photographed.
Access means you can obtain it and have some conditions in which to enter it. Time, language, teaching, reference tools, perhaps a friend who will not laugh at you when you ask what just happened.
And value?
Value means people treat it as worth preserving, teaching, collecting, arguing about. Prestige is when that value becomes publicly recognizable and transferable as status or authority. And all four can exist separately.
Yes. A book can be visible and inaccessible, valuable and unread, prestigious and badly taught, easy to buy and hard to enter. Or it can be read intensely by people who have no institutional authority to make their reading count.
That last one matters. Otherwise, we have invented a reader who only exists in a seminar room.
The French sociologist Bernard Lahire is useful here. People are not one clean social type. You cannot look at a book on a shelf and know the owner's whole class position, education, desire, or reading history. The same object can mean different things in different lives.
So no detective work with the bookshelf.
No detective work with the bookshelf. We can talk about prestige mechanisms. We cannot diagnose everyone trapped inside them. What about the Hawking Index? The thing that claimed Ulysses had an absurdly low completion rate because Kindle highlights dried up early.
It is a limited trace, not a verdict. It tracks where highlights occur in Kindle books. It does not tell us who owned the book, who read without highlighting, who reread, who borrowed a paper copy, who skipped around, or why anybody stopped. It can name a contemporary feeling. Cultural recognition sometimes exceeds lived reading. It cannot explain a century of literary prestige. So the statistic stays in the drawer unless it behaves itself.
We do not need an algorithm to tell us that people can feel summoned by a book they have not entered.
Then where do we start?
Not with readers failing the book, with the fact that somebody first made the book difficult to obtain.
You mean censorship?
Censorship, yes, but let us not make the familiar mistake. A ban does not automatically turn every book into a classic.
No? That is very inconvenient for my theory.
Your theory is also an advertisement for every prosecutor who thinks he is helping sales.
I said it was inconvenient, not wrong.
Then let us test it against another book.
I assume you are about to bring up Lady Chatterley's Lover.
No, it is too easy, and it happened under a different legal and commercial regime. The 1960 British trial over a cheap mass paperback is important, but it is not the same story as Ulysses.
Then what is the test case?
Radclyffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, published in 1928.
The lesbian novel that was banned in Britain.
Yes, it is a much better control case for the question we have just asked. It belongs to the interwar world of obscenity enforcement, publicity, uneven transnational circulation, and Paris-related printing. It also became famous through suppression. But it did not become a global high modernist monument in the same way Ulysses did.
That is already a dangerous sentence. It sounds as though one book won the competition and the other failed.
No, Hall's book did not vanish while Joyce's became a monument. But the interesting part is that its public was already forming while the state was trying to suppress it.
The letters matter here. Hall received thousands of them. Readers recognized themselves in Stephen Gordon, protested the ban, or said the novel gave them words for a life they could not otherwise name.
So the public was not a later academic recovery.
No. One reader who encountered the 1949 British Republication as a teenager later called it a Bible and a lifeline. That is not a slogan we have invented afterwards. It is someone saying that a book reached them when almost nothing else did.
But a Bible can also be a difficult inheritance.
Certainly, the novel has offered support and affirmation, but readers and critics have never agreed on what it gives them. Its sexological language, Stephen's masculinity, its sacrificial ending, its racial and class politics, and its relation to trans history have all become sites of argument. It is not the lesser afterlife of Ulysses. It is a counter-public landmark and a continuing argument inside queer history.
Give me the legal parallel.
In New York in 1921, the serial publication of Nausicaa became the flashpoint. The law, the editors, and the defense argued about obscenity, disgust, possible corruption, and what a reader might understand or be aroused by.
In Britain in 1928, officials could concede that Hall's novel was sincere, courageous, high-minded, and beautifully expressed.
Then, they treated its plea for recognition of lesbian life as a danger to people into whose hands it might fall. Into whose hands? That is doing a lot of work.
It is a small phrase with a whole social map inside it. The law does not merely look at a page and decide whether it contains sex. It imagines distribution. Young people, families, public circulation, improper proximity. Which hands are supposed to remain clean?
And the state decides which hands are likely to be contaminated.
Censorship is not only a judgment about text, it is a theory of readership.
But the two trials were not the same.
Absolutely not. They happened under different laws, courts, national settings, procedures, and political conditions. We are not saying one is the sequel to the other. We are comparing a structure. Both authorities imagine a vulnerable reader who must be protected from a book.
And both bans made the books more visible.
They did. But visibility is not the same as a single later cultural life. Hall's novel became a shared and disputed object, a text used for recognition, survival, and sexual intelligibility, but also criticized for the terms on which it offers recognition. Joyce's novel became a modernist monument, supported by specialist commentary, editions, syllabi, conferences, and professional reading practices.
Then the difference is not that Hall had a community and Joyce had institutions.
No. Communities have institutions, and institutions make captivities. The relevant contrast is more exact. Ulysses was repeatedly converted into a generalizable problem of modernist form and professionally credentialed interpretation. The Well retained a more explicit relation to readers, making claims for sexual and gender recognition, even as they disagreed sharply about the book's politics.
So what made the difference? Joyce was difficult and Hall was not?
No, that would be exactly the kind of smug explanation we are trying to avoid. It would turn difficulty into an intrinsic aristocracy. We need to ask how a particular kind of visibility was converted into literary credit, and then into institutionally valued reading. We need to ask which public gathered around each book, which institutions did the gathering, and what each book's form made possible.
Are we now able to tell the whole history of Hall's public?
No, and the limitation is instructive. The current AHRC project on the novel is explicitly building what it calls the first full reception history, using letters, oral histories, archives, translations, visual culture, and community engagement. We can now state that Hall's afterlife was plural and contested. We should not pretend that its global route has been fully mapped.
Fine. A ban makes visibility. It does not decide what kind of future visibility we'll have.
And that takes us back to the episode that got Ulysses into trouble.
Nausicaa.
Yes. If the law thought the episode was dangerous, what was it actually reading?
A man masturbating on a beach while watching a young woman.
That is part of it. It is not the whole form of the episode.
I am relieved. I worried that 50 minutes would turn out to be only a very elaborate avoidance of the obvious.
The obvious is important. But Nausicaa begins as something like a women's magazine written through too many mirrors. It contains beauty advice, fashion, romance, devotional sentiment, commercial fantasy, fireworks, social watching, and a great deal of language about how a woman should appear.
Including the famous eyebrow product.
Madame Vera Verity, directress of the Woman Beautiful page of the Princess Novelette, recommends Eyebrow Line. It is a comic name, but the point is not that Gerty is silly because she uses it. The passage makes femininity itself look manufactured. The seductive eye is not simply a natural essence. It is produced through advice, commodities, labor, aspiration, and being watched.
So Joyce is not making a clean contrast between real woman and artificial product.
This is where the reader enters the problem. We recognize the magazine language as cliché. We hear the sentimental rhythm and think, I know what this is. I am above it.
The little pleasure of getting the joke.
Yes, the pleasure of being the kind of reader who sees through cheap language. But then the episode asks what we do with that competence. Does recognizing cliché become another way of treating Gerty as an object we can assess, explain, dismiss, or rescue?
She sees Bloom too, though.
She does. Joyce gives us the blunt phrase, "She saw that he saw." Gerty is not inert. She notices him, performs for a gaze, and wants to be wanted.
And that still does not make the scene symmetrical.
No, performance is not consent. Desire is not a contract. The narrative keeps moving between romance, satire, advertising, piety, fantasy, and desire. It will not give us a clean place outside those voices.
You are resisting two very tempting verdicts. One says Gerty is a passive victim of commercial culture. The other says she knows exactly what she is doing, so that settles everything.
Both are too easy. In a close reading of the episode, Thomas O'Connor makes the useful point that critics can repeat Bloom's action if they use Gerty only to confirm their own theory. We start by wanting to know who she really is. Is she a cliché? A victim? A seductress? A queer agent? A cruel joke? The episode frustrates the demand for one true Gerty behind the language.
And then she walks away, and Bloom notices the limp.
Yes, he says, "Glad I didn't know it when she was on show." It is one of the ugliest little phrases in the novel.
Because he treats the previous scene as a display with a hidden defect.
The phrase "on show" reveals the market logic of his looking. Gerty's body becomes a product that has failed to disclose its condition.
But the revelation also tempts the reader to solve her. We are invited to say, this explains the performance.
That is the test. The limp does not finally reveal Gerty. It reveals the condition of Bloom's gaze, and it tests our urge to make her legible through one decisive explanation. Disability, magazine culture, desire, victimhood. Each can become a way of possessing her.
This is why the episode belongs in our larger argument.
Yes, Ulysses did not rise above commercial culture and become difficult somewhere else. It makes difficulty through collisions, popular print, bodily life, advertising, sentiment, spectacle, obscene desire, all pressed against one another.
Which is uncomfortable for the later image of it as a pure high modernist monument.
More than uncomfortable. Cultural historian Andreas Huyssen argues that modernism historically constructed itself against a feminized image of mass culture, commercial entertainment, sentimental reading, supposedly degraded forms. Nausicaa is made from those forms. The book later used to test refined reading is saturated with the material refined reading was trained to dismiss.
So the court imagines a reader too vulnerable for the episode, and the later institution imagines a reader trained enough to master it.
That is the structural tension. But before we get to the school, we have to get the book across borders and into people's hands at all. Good, because every time people talk about Ulysses, Paris appears like a mist machine. A little bookshop, blue covers, genius, cigarettes, and somehow history occurs.
Paris deserves better than the mist machine. Before it was a symbol, the book was a physical problem. It had to be typed, printed, posted, inspected, seized, smuggled, sold, borrowed, hidden, and sometimes destroyed.
In other words, the book was heavy.
And it passed through institutions that had machinery. In literary historian Kevin Birmingham's account, the point is severe. The government gained the power to censor words by mastering the ability to circulate them. Postal systems, customs systems, legal systems, all the things that make print move, can also make it stop.
So censorship is not merely someone saying, "I disapprove of this paragraph."
No, it is material infrastructure. The early circulation of Ulysses depended on little magazines and fragile roots. Suppression involved postal surveillance, seizure, court action, threats to publishers, customs controls, and the destruction of copies. The book's early scarcity was not simply a luxury strategy that clever people invented in order to make it glamorous, though it could become glamorous afterward.
Yes, scarcity can be converted into prestige. But first, it was imposed.
Which keeps us from romanticizing the ban. A rare book may look desirable on a shelf. Its rarity may also mean someone lost money, took a risk, did invisible labor, or was told that the public must be protected from the very thing they were trying to circulate.
Name the labor. Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap edited the little review. They absorbed the legal risk of making Joyce serially available.
Harriet Shaw Weaver supported Joyce financially and published him. Sylvia Beach took on publication through Shakespeare and Company. Then there were typists, printers, subscribers, booksellers, readers, smugglers, the people whose work made the book's existence possible.
The blue copy is not an isolated relic of male genius.
It is a compressed history of women doing the jobs that make a genius portable.
But that can become too neat. We should not turn them into saints in the margin.
No. They had aesthetic commitments, political disagreements, practical limits, fear, accommodation, and different ideas about public responsibility. Anderson defended a radical freedom for art. That did not make the legal machinery disappear, or care very much about her theory of art.
The law was interested in what might happen when the pages reached the wrong reader. That is why we need to think of censorship as a system of reader allocation, not merely a critic with police powers.
Where does Veblen come in? You promised me a theory of showing off.
Veblen helps with a limited observation. A costly, rare, inconvenient object can have social value apart from practical use. A limited edition can signal a relation to leisure, expense, taste, and education. That can help explain why a blue edition of Ulysses became publicly meaningful even for people who did not read every page.
But it cannot explain the printer.
Or the editor, the smuggler, the reader who borrowed a copy, the person who read it under legal risk, or the historical production of scarcity. Veblen gives us a mechanism of visible value. He does not give us a complete psychology of ownership.
You are saying the blue cover contains two histories at once, luxury and contraband.
At least two. Luxury, contraband, labor, censorship, desire, international commerce, and later, classroom authority. That is why the book on the shelf is not a trivial object.
And why Paris is not a mist machine.
Not yet. Now Paris becomes harder. I am prepared to be corrected.
Literary scholar Pascal Casanova's point is that a literary capital is not simply a pretty city where writers meet. It accumulates authority. It possesses what she calls literary capital, the capacity to recognize a formal revolt as literature with a claim beyond the nation that produced it.
A city becomes a bank.
In a sense, literary credit is extended, withheld, accumulated, converted. It is not the same as popularity. A work can be famous without credit, or credited before it is widely read.
Why did Joyce need Parisian credit?
He did not need it in the sense that Paris created his talent. But an Irish writer in English faced a difficult position. London carried imperial linguistic and institutional authority.
And a national Irish literary role could be restrictive in a different way. Be the authentic voice of your people, but do not disturb the larger map.
Paris offers a third position.
Not an escape from Dublin, and not an escape from English, but a field in which departure from both imperial and provincial expectations could be recognized as a claim on world literature. I can hear the danger already. World literature is one of those phrases that makes a city vanish into a passport stamp.
Good. Universalization can enable a book to travel, survive, be preserved, translated, argued over, and encountered by readers who would otherwise never meet it.
But it can also subtract. A colonial city, its commercial texture, gendered forms, bodily life, prejudice, municipal mess, can become background for an abstract monument.
Universal is not the same as innocent.
Precisely. It may be the name given to a local conflict once it has been made exportable.
And your chosen example of what gets erased is Gerty's magazine world.
Yes, the book becomes the emblem of serious modernism, partly by being read away from the forms that make Nausicaa possible. Cheap print, fashion advice, sentimental fiction, Catholic social feeling, commercial femininity, display.
Yet without traveling, the book might have remained trapped in a different local system.
I do not want a romantic localism. Circulation can free a work from national and imperial containment. The point is to ask what world literary credit changes. Which features become central? Which become noise? Who has the authority to decide?
Can we prove the root, though? You have Paris the bookshop, Paris the printer, Paris the capital, Paris the legend.
We can now prove one root. It is smaller than global circulation, which is why I like it.
Beach drew up a prospectus in April 1921 and kept a subscriber ledger. By 7 August, there were only 260 orders. Readers could choose a signed Dutch paper copy, a French handmade paper copy, or an ordinary copy. None was cheap. Even the ordinary copy required a serious investment.
So literary credit was not a mist that settled on the book. It was a ledger, a price, a name, an address, and somebody deciding whether a book they had not seen was worth paying for.
The limited edition of 1,000 copies appeared on 2 February 1922 and sold out by 15 June. Beach and Joyce helped mail parcels from Shakespeare and Company. Joyce reportedly discovered that a parcel weighed 1 kilo and 550 grams when he was helping with labels.
That is the circulation route. A Paris bookshop turned literary expectation into paid, addressed objects moving toward particular readers. It does not explain the whole world. It does explain how credit acquired a material itinerary.
And once the book has been credited as world literature, somebody must teach people how to recognize that credit.
That brings us to the school.
Here comes the part where you explain that universities are innocent because you have spent too much time in them.
I am not going to explain that. I am going to explain why the academy took over is too lazy to be useful.
Proceed with institutional caution.
Literary critic John Guillory says that a canon is not simply a sacred list of books that have passed a test. In schools, the canon functions as a pedagogic device.
With better plumbing.
Yes, it produces effects of literacy and linguistic distinction, and it shifts our attention from the objects to the means of transmission. The important question is not only, is Joyce on the syllabus? It is, who receives the time, teaching, language, books, reference tools, interpretive community, and credentials through which a reading of Joyce can count?
So one person holds an edition, a guide, a teacher, a seminar group, a day without paid labor, and the habit of rereading. Another person holds a borrowed copy after work, has no guide, no quiet, no one to ask, and thinks the book probably belongs to somebody else.
Yes, the difference is not intelligence. It is a distribution of conditions.
That sounds reasonable. It also sounds as though the university turns those conditions into a badge. Difficulty became positively valued because it gave cultural objects a kind of rarity. The ability to read difficulty could become professionally valuable.
That does not mean the university invented the difficulty of Ulysses. It means that some institutions made the capacity to name and handle difficulty into credentialed competence.
And the reader who has the credential begins to feel that the book belongs to them.
Sometimes, I know that temptation. If you have learned the references, read the criticism, survived the seminar, taught the chapter, it is easy to mistake that accumulation for ownership. You say, I can explain it, therefore I possess it.
That is more honest than I expected.
I am trying to avoid becoming the villain in your municipal bookcase drama.
Too late. But you are a sympathetic villain.
Thank you. The point is that teaching can open a book. It can give a reader a vocabulary for confusion, a way to return, a permission not to understand immediately. But teaching is also distributed unequally. Admissions, class, language, time, assessment, and credentials shape who receives those resources and whose reading is publicly recognized.
Then law and school are doing the same thing after all. One keeps the untrained reader out. The other lets the trained reader in.
No, that is too quick, and it is exactly the equivalence we must resist. The law in the obscenity cases restricts and punishes. A school can expand access, give readers tools, and build forms of common interpretation. Calling a seminar a courtroom would be stupid.
But
both institutions make claims about reader capacity. The court imagines a reader vulnerable to harm. The school imagines a reader competent to recognize difficulty. Neither simply receives a natural reader from the world. Each produces a social category.
Vulnerable reader. Credentialed reader.
Yes, different authority, different aim, different power. But both sort relations to a text.
And Nausicaa makes both sorts look unstable.
The court encounters the episode as potential moral injury. A seminar may encounter it as irony, narrative voice, gendered mass culture, disability, readerly complicity, modernist form.
Neither reading is simply false, but neither is innocent either.
The legal reading can turn sex and popular culture into danger. The academic reading can turn them into an object of mastery.
So the certified reader may be more sophisticated, but not automatically more ethical. Do we know the institutional history well enough? Which school? Which period? Which curriculum? Which people made Ulysses a certified difficulty?
We have one present-day cite that makes the mechanism visible, though not its full history. Cornell University's Spring 2025 course, Reading the Media of Joyce's Ulysses, taught by Professor Jeremy Braddock.
Its library guide is almost a diagram of Guillory's argument. There is a research method, reference works, subject headings, specialist databases, Joyce journals, archival collections, and a named reference librarian. The course does not just hand students a blue book and say, "Good luck,"
Which is not a criticism of the course. It is an X-ray of the resources that make a difficult book teachable. Guidance, catalogs, collections, vocabulary, and someone whose job includes helping you ask a better question.
and it is not the origin of the Joyce industry. We are not pretending one Cornell course caused a century of canonization.
No. It gives the abstract word institution a door, a catalog, and a person at the other side of the desk.
I want another piece of the book before we let the university claim all the difficulty.
Aeolus.
The newspaper episode.
It makes a different version of the same point. In Nausicaa, the novel forces us through magazine culture, advertising, romance, and display. In Aeolus, it turns the reader into a consumer of newspaper machinery.
You mean the headlines?
The headlines, the interruptions, the way the page begins to act like a public space full of competing claims for attention. We are not simply told that Dublin has newspapers. The prose makes us move through their pressure. Big claims, small claims, civic rhetoric, jokes, puffery, partial information, men talking as if they are printing themselves.
A remarkably contemporary sensation.
Yes, though we must not pretend Joyce invented the feed. The point is more exact. The chapter makes print culture into form. If you try to read it as transparent narrative, it keeps throwing a headline across your path. You have to decide whether it is an instruction, an interruption, a parody, a summary, or another voice trying to sell you importance.
That does sound like difficult reading. But it is difficulty made from a mass form, not difficulty made by abandoning mass forms.
This is why I do not want the episode to say that the university later imposed complexity on an ordinary book. The book has already turned commercial and public language into a formal problem. Aeolus makes the newspaper difficult by refusing the smoothness newspapers usually promise.
Newsprint promises smoothness?
It promises that the page will sort the world for you. Here is the headline. Here is the story. Here is the authority. Joyce keeps disrupting that confidence. The headline can inflate, mislead, interrupt, or mock. The reader cannot remain a passive recipient of the printed public sphere.
So the novel takes the language that was supposed to make public life legible and makes it unreadable in a new way.
Not unreadable, rereadable. There is a difference. The episode makes us work through the mechanisms that usually work on us without being noticed.
That is a very academic sentence.
It is also an ordinary experience. You pick up a paper, or now you open a screen, and you do not simply receive facts. You receive emphasis, repetition, false urgency, prestige, outrage, advertising, omission, a little pile of voices arranging your attention.
And you are saying Joyce makes that arrangement visible by making it inconvenient.
Yes, the inconvenience is formal. It is not a noble fog laid down by a genius to keep citizens away. The novel uses the materials of commercial modernity, advertisements, headlines, public rhetoric, and turns their ordinary command of attention back into an object of attention.
Which is where I become uneasy again. A reader with more training will get more of the joke.
They may, but that does not mean the untrained reader has nothing. The chapter can be disorienting before it becomes expertly legible. A reader can feel its noise, speed, vanity, and civic absurdity without identifying every illusion. Expert reading adds possibilities. It should not be treated as the only authentic response.
That is important. Otherwise, access means handing everybody a guidebook and asking them to perform the correct bewilderment.
Precisely. The goal is not uniform reading. It is a broader distribution of the means to make more kinds of reading possible.
And Aeolus gives us a second answer to the question of what the book does with mass culture.
Yes, it does not merely include newspapers as social background. It forces the reader through their technologies of public attention. That matters to our argument because the later monument can look as if it escaped the commercial world, but the monument is built partly from the pressure of that world on its pages.
Nausicaa gives us femininity, consumption, looking, and the reader's smugness. Aeolus gives us public print, circulation, headlines, and the reader's attention.
One scene is enough for the close reading. The second scene prevents the argument from making Gerty carry the whole burden of mass culture and gender. It also shows that Joyce's formal difficulty is not a single thing. It is produced through different collisions of register.
Then the university has a genuine object to teach.
It does. That is why criticism of institutional literacy cannot be the childish claim that it invented complexity. The question is, what happens when the institution makes one way of handling that complexity culturally authoritative?
I still have a problem with your generous account of teaching.
Only one?
Several, but I have learned to cue. When you say the classroom gives people tools, it sounds entirely admirable. And it is admirable. But the tools are not handed out in a neutral room. Somebody decides which vocabulary is elegant, which question is naive, which interpretation is serious, which accent sounds competent, which reader becomes a future teacher.
I agree. That is precisely why you brought in Guillory. He does not ask only who gets added to the canon. He asks what institutional forms regulate access to cultural capital in the first place. A curriculum is not just an anthology. It is a social arrangement of time, language, evaluation, and recognition.
And the arrangement can be generous and excluding at once.
Very often. A brilliant teacher can invite readers in, while the wider institution still restricts who has the time, money, confidence, language, or prior preparation to arrive. We should be able to say both things without turning the teacher into a censor or the university into a church.
You are defending the teacher now.
I am defending the possibility of teaching. There is a difference.
Fair enough. But I have watched people use difficult books as proof that they are not like other people.
So have I. And I have been one of those people in smaller ways. There is a defensive pleasure in being able to say, no, you have misunderstood. You need more context. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is a way of protecting one's own authority.
The phrase, "you need more context," can be a locked door with excellent manners.
Yes, it can also be an offer. The ethical difference depends on whether context is treated as property or as something shared.
Let us stay with that. Suppose a listener opens Ulysses, reads 10 pages, and says, I have no idea what is happening. What does the certified reader owe them?
Not a lecture about inadequacy, not 1,000 references delivered as punishment, perhaps a small invitation. Start with one person, one street, one bodily need, one joke. Read a section aloud. Find an edition with notes. Read it with someone. Allow yourself to be confused without treating confusion as failure.
And if they still hate it?
Then they hate it. Reading is not a loyalty oath. A difficult book does not become democratic because every person is required to admire it.
Good. Because compulsory admiration is how monuments defend themselves.
The point is not that everyone must be converted. The point is that access should mean a fair chance to form a relation, to love, dislike, abandon, return to, or argue with the text, without the relation being pre-decided by social distance.
That is a stronger version of your promise metaphor. The book on the shelf promises not that one day you will become the right kind of reader. It promises that one day you might meet it on less unequal terms.
Yes, though I would not give the book too much credit. Books do not distribute those terms. People and institutions do.
There is the municipal improvement again.
I am not apologizing for it.
You should not. Libraries have given more people a better intellectual life than most monuments have.
That may be the nicest thing you have said all day.
Do not become sentimental. I still think the Blue Book is smug.
It has earned some smugness. It has survived courts, customs officers, printers, scholars, and us.
But not the shelf reorganization.
Never the shelf reorganization.
Let me press you once more. You have a court deciding who must be protected from a book, and a school deciding who has learned to read it. Are you not making both institutions sound like sorting offices?
In a limited sense, yes. But the comparison only works if we say where it breaks. The court uses coercion. It can ban, seize, threaten, punish. Its reader is imagined through danger and corruption.
A school can distribute literacy and access. It can also ration them through admissions, fees, language, assessment, and hierarchy. Its reader is imagined through competence and recognition.
The same text moves from too dangerous for some people to meaningful only for others. That is the paradox. Not a smooth history, not a conspiracy, not a moral equivalence. Attention. The book's social life keeps producing readers who are either underprotected or overqualified.
And what happens to the person in between?
That is the person I care about. The reader who is neither an imagined innocent to be protected, nor an expert authorized to certify the text. The reader who is willing to be confused, who may come through translation, through a library, through a friend, through a class later in life, through one passage that catches them.
You want the middle reader.
I want to stop treating that reader as an embarrassment.
But difficult books do ask for things. Time, attention, a willingness to be lost.
They do. Access is not the opposite of difficulty. It is access to the conditions through which difficulty can become a lived practice rather than a private luxury.
And no one has yet made us effective app for an afternoon.
Though many have tried to sell us one.
So the real political question is not, how do we make Joyce easy?
No, it is, how do we make the means of entering difficult books more shareable? Libraries, teaching, translations, annotated editions, time, quiet, money, companions, permission to fail, permission to return.
Permission not to finish?
Especially that. Finishing is not the only form of reading.
Then I owe the Blue Book an apology.
I would not go that far. It has been looking smug all morning.
I still think it can carry prestige. A costly, rare, difficult object can announce a relation to leisure, education, and taste. Veblen is not completely wrong just because he makes everyone sound dreadful.
He describes a mechanism, not a soul. A book may accrue display value. It may signal a cultivated relation to time.
But here is the correction. People are not one clean social type. The same Ulysses can be a teaching tool, an inheritance, a failed aspiration, a private delight, a joke, a relic of an old relationship, or something bought because the cover was beautiful. The book can be pretending to be possible.
That is better than pretending to be read.
I'm revising my position under pressure. Please note the date.
I have noted it. But the promise of possible reading should not become an alibi for permanent exclusion. If cultural significance can be socially installed, then conditions of entry can be socially shared.
You are back to municipal improvement.
Libraries are municipal improvement. Public education is municipal improvement. A good annotated edition is a small public utility.
You will soon be asking the council to install footnotes at bus stops.
I would like that very much.
I know.
The point is not to turn Ulysses into homework, nor is it to debunk the book, because its prestige has a history. Constructed prestige is not false prestige. Every cultural value has conditions. Making them visible is not the same as saying the value is unreal.
It is saying the value is not self-sufficient.
It does not float above labor, law, cities, institutions, readers, and time.
There is one more thing the shelf does. It can shame people before the book has had a chance to speak.
Yes. You have not read Ulysses becomes a little social test. The question is often asked as though reading were a proof of worth rather than a relation formed under particular conditions.
And then people lie, or become defensive, or treat the book as a hostile relative who must be visited once a year.
Which is why partial reading matters. A person can meet one sentence, one episode, one joke, one city street, and return later. There are readers who have lived with parts of Ulysses for decades without possessing the total map. The book's prestige should not turn that partial relation into embarrassment.
Nor should partial reading become a fashionable excuse for never trying.
No, it is an invitation to honesty. Reading is not completion in a bureaucratic sense. It is attention that can be interrupted, resumed, refused, shared, and changed.
A humane policy for a very inhumane bookcase.
That is all I am asking.
Let us return to the shelf then. It can display a book,
It cannot lend you the afternoon,
or the teacher,
or the language.
or the permission to make a fool of yourself for 50 pages.
That one may be the most important. Difficult literature often looks as if it belongs to people who already know what they are doing. But the conditions of reading are not private signs of superior nature. They are social resources.
And Ulysses is a particularly odd monument because it is built from the things monuments normally pretend to be above. Advertising, newspapers, romance, dirty jokes, bodies, city gossip, prayer, commercial language, public prejudice, food, sex.
Yes, it does not become difficult by leaving the ordinary world. It becomes difficult by swallowing it whole and refusing to separate its languages neatly.
Which makes the later image of the immaculate high cultural object rather misleading.
Not wholly false, perhaps. The book is formally extraordinary, but misleading if it hides the material and popular life inside it. Misleading if it tells the reader that the only proper response is reverence. Misleading if it lets institutions forget the conditions under which reading becomes possible.
So it did not go viral.
Not in the ordinary sense. It became durable through slower machinery, restriction, risk, print, credit, teaching, editions, prestige, and readers who kept making new uses of it.
And the question, who was allowed to read it, has more than one answer.
Yes, the law once imagined readers who must be protected from it. Later institutions trained readers who could authenticate it. The book itself kept making both positions uncomfortable.
We are not ending with, everyone must now read Ulysses.
Certainly not. That would turn the monument into homework and repeat the allocation we have just criticized.
Then what are we ending with?
A smaller, harder question. What books already seem to belong to somebody else? And what would change if the time, teaching, language, companions, and permission needed to enter them were treated as common cultural infrastructure?
A shelf can display a book.
It cannot lend you the afternoon, the teacher, or the language.
But it can remind you that these things should not be private luxuries.
Yes, and perhaps that a book is not ashamed of waiting. Only readers are taught to be ashamed.
I am Bear. This is Critical Animal. If I got under your skin, good. Subscribe and bring me to your next dinner party. See you next time.